Welcome to this tutorial video. In this video, we introduce the domain Land, Territories and Resources of the Indigenous Navigator's Climate Change module. In this video, we introduce the concepts covered in this domain and the relevant human rights instruments. The surveys look at the recognition and protection of Indigenous rights to land, territories and resources, specifically in the context of climate change and climate change-related laws, plans and policies. This includes the right to free, prior and informed consent in cases of relocation, the rights to conserve, protect and use their lands, territories and waters, and the right to compensation, restitution and redress in instances where Indigenous peoples are displaced from their land. Recognition of these rights are critical for protecting Indigenous peoples' right to land and natural resources from exploitation due to climate change-related policies or measures. Ensuring Indigenous peoples' rights to free, prior and informed consent and effective compensation and remedy are protected in instances where they are displaced or relocated due to climate change-related measures. And ensuring states support Indigenous communities to conserve, protect and use their lands, territories and waters. The first category focuses on the recognition, protection and adjudication of inherent rights to land, territories and natural resources of Indigenous peoples. Related rights are recognized in international law in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Articles 25 to 28, and the International Labour Organization Convention 169. In climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction projects, land plays an important role, leading to competition for access to and use of land. Indigenous lands, territories, and resources are often at risk for carbon credit or conservation projects. For this reason, recognition and protection of Indigenous peoples' right to their lands, territories, and natural resources is even more critical in the context of climate change. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, in Article 26, refers to the rights of Indigenous peoples to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess in the present. However, UNDRIP Article 25 has a broader scope and outlines that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. Indigenous peoples thus have the right to maintain their spiritual relationship in territories and resources that are no longer in their possession, but which they have owned or occupied in the past. Human rights treaty bodies, such as the UN Committee on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or CESCA, and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, have also pointed to these obligations in international law. The National Survey assesses whether Indigenous rights to lands, territories and resources are recognized in national legislation, the extent of this recognition, and then specifically if this recognition is found in climate change-related laws and policies. Both surveys monitor any violations of these rights specifically in the context of climate change-related laws and policies. The second category relates to state obligations to protect Indigenous peoples against eviction and ensure due process in cases of evictions related to climate change-related projects and measures. While climate change-related measures can lead to competition for land, Indigenous peoples are still protected from eviction, and there must be due process in cases of evictions in connection with climate change-related projects and measures. This must include processes to ensure free, prior and informed consent. Article 10 of UNDRIP clearly states that Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned, and after their agreement on just and fair compensation and, where possible, with the option of return. This is reinforced in the International Labour Organization Convention No. 169, or ILO 169. Additionally, protection against forced eviction is a core aspect of the right to adequate housing. This is a fundamental right protected under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ICESCA. States have an obligation to provide all persons with a reasonable degree of tenure security that guarantees legal protection against forced evictions. The National Survey monitors whether dispossession of Indigenous peoples has occurred due to climate change-related measures and projects without free, prior and informed consent. The Community Survey then seeks to document experiences of Indigenous peoples who may have been dispossessed due to climate change-related activities and what kind of activities these were. The next category is environment. This category relates directly to Article 29 of UNDRIP, which sets out the rights of Indigenous people to participate in the use, management and conservation of natural resources in protected areas. For example, in the context of climate change-related measures, carbon sequestration through conservation is often used as a strategy for climate change mitigation. This can put the rights of Indigenous peoples to use, manage, and conserve natural resources in protected areas at risk. These rights are also reinforced in binding standards. For example, ILO Convention 169 outlines the rights of Indigenous peoples to participate in the use, management, and conservation of resources. The surveys monitor whether this right is recognized in legislation, and whether there are any mechanisms such as assistance programs that exist to support the realization of this right, and document experiences of any assistance programs to support the realization of this right. Questions related to compensation, restitution, and redress are only found in the Community Survey. The state has an obligation to provide effective redress to Indigenous peoples for any act of dispossession in the context of climate change or related laws, policies, or activities. Article 8 of UNDRIP calls on states to provide effective redress for any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories, or resources. This is reinforced in a binding international standard in ILO Convention 169, which says that when return to traditional lands is not possible, Indigenous peoples should be provided with lands of equal quality and legal status to those that they previously occupied. The issue of adequate redress, restitution, and compensation is also linked to the fundamental right to remedy, which is enshrined in binding human rights instruments. This includes the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR, which says that parties must ensure that any person whose rights or freedoms are violated shall have an effective remedy, and that this right to claim remedy should be determined by competent judicial, administrative, or legal authorities. In summary, redress refers to the need for states to provide access to effective remedy procedures. Remedy may involve a court decision reverting the state's decision to require relocation. Restitution includes the right to return and the right of Indigenous peoples to return to their traditional lands. Compensation refers to what is given in recognition of loss. The standards say that it must be lands of equal or better quality and legal status. The questions assess if adequate redress, restitution, or compensation was received for dispossession of Indigenous peoples or the use or exploitation of lands, territories, and resources due to climate change-related projects or activities. Additionally, whether the compensation considered non-market values such as cultural, religious, spiritual, or environmental value.